morning and welcome. My name is Sandra Stevenson and I'm a governor of the OPC and a deputy director of photography at the Washington Post. And we are so excited to present another program in our series of How I Did It, pairing award-winning journalists and their editors. Tonight, we're talking with Marcus Yam, a staff photographer and roving correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and Calvin Hom, the paper's executive director of photography. Marcus, as you may know, won a Pulitzer Prize in 2022 for his images documenting the U.S. departure from Afghanistan. Just to give you the lay of the land for the evening, for those who have not participated in our session, we will talk for about a half an hour and then we'll take questions. Please put your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to all of them before the program ends at approximately 7 p.m. So let me give some bios. Calvin Hom, as I said, is the executive director of photography at the Los Angeles Times, starting in November of 2021. He joined the Times in 1993 as a picture editor and has helped coach and guide countless photographers over the years. He has served as an editor, mentor, coach, and problem solver to the photo staff, making himself available all hours of the day and night and weekend to talk through professional challenges and assignments. I can totally relate to that. He started his career as a staff photographer for UPI in Kansas City in 1983 and was a National Press Photographer Association Sports Photographer of the Year in 1985. While at the Times, he has received several awards and accolades. He was part of the photo staff that won the Angus McDougall Overall Excellence in Editing Award for newspapers in 2004 and 2005, and the Best Use of Photography in the Pictures of the Year International Competition in 2005. In 2014, Calvin and Mary Cooney received a Lucy Award for Photo Editor of the Year. Marcus Yam is a roving Los Angeles Times foreign correspondent and staff photographer. Born and raised in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, he left his career in aerospace engineering to become a photographer. His goal to take viewers to the front lines of conflict, struggle, and intimacy. His approach is deeply rooted in curiosity, dignity, and persistence. In 2022, Marcus Yam won the Pulitzer Prize for Breaking News Photography for images documenting the U.S. departure of Afghanistan that captured the human cost and historic change in the country. Yam is a two-time recipient of the Robert Kennedy Human Rights Journalism Award, notably in 2019 for his unflinching body of work showing everyday plight of Gazans during the deadly clashes in the Gaza Strip. He was also part of two Pulitzer Prize winning breaking news teams that covered the San Bernardino, California terrorist attack in 2015 for the Los Angeles Times, and a deadly landslide in Oslo, Washington. In 2014 for the Seattle Times. His previous work has also earned him Emmy Awards for News Documentary, World Press Photo Award, DART Award for Trauma Coverage, Scripps Howard Visual Journalism Award, Picture of the Year International's Newspaper Photographer of the Year, Society of Professional Journalists Sigma Delta Chi Award, National Headliner Award, and an Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award. When he's not working, Marcus loves minimizing and organizing his life for efficiency for emergencies. These are quite hefty bios and very impressive. And I would like to say that I personally have worked with Marcus Yam in the very beginning of his career, and it's such a pleasure to see the intern who I worked with at the New York Times become the journalist that you are today. So kudos to you. And Calvin, kudos to you for growing and enriching a young photographer in our industry. So before we discuss how you made the work that you did in Afghanistan, I think one of the curious things that is in the industry is it would be great if we could talk about how you became a visual correspondent. What was the conversation like, and how did you arrive to that career change? Who shall I toss it to first?
Let's start with Marcus. Marcus,
Okay.
Okay. In early 2020, I felt like I was just starting to hit the glass, sort of like the glass ceiling at my job, and I was wanting to find a new challenge. I was starting to not feel challenged anymore, and I'm sure everybody has felt that way in their jobs. I went to the executive editor at that point, who was Norm Pearlstein, and I asked him for advice, like, what should I do? How do I overcome this like plateau, I guess? And and I guess he looked at my personnel file and basically saw that I make these occasional trips overseas once a year and do a big story, a big project, and he saw that I did well in them and excelled in them. And he actually, you know, uh, floated the idea of, and kind of worked with me on the idea of like, well, what do you think about being a foreign correspondent? And I think that when he said that, my jaw just dropped to the floor, and I was like, are you serious? Because in our business, like, these opportunities are so rare for photographers, at least, and it almost never happens. I mean, maybe 30 years ago, when the news business was flush with billions of dollars, and people flew first class, maybe, and I just wasn't sure if it was a thing yet. And I think we did a trial run, and I remember floating this idea back to Calvin. And Calvin, I'll let you take it from here. And I remember what Calvin told me the entire time. Calvin was my director of photography then, and wasn't entirely like, entirely sold on this idea.
so this whole process took 9 months. And so periodically, Marcus would come to me for advice. And I would say, well, I didn't really like the idea, actually. And because he was our main guy, he was our main guy on every major events, whether it's um, a wildfire in Northern California, hurricane in Miami, overseas and in Iraq. He was our main guy. So for me to put him overseas, especially in a time in 2020 when COVID was happening, Black Lives Matter, to Trump, the migration, and you got to remember the LA Times' main focus is California and the West. And here's Marcus going off to, well, he ended up temporarily in South Korea. It just didn't sit well with me. And I'm like, well, I think it's great for you. I'm not sure it was great for me. And it took me a while to actually come around to it. And it turns out, I hate to admit, but I was probably wrong on that. But
And so, Marcus, while you were in South Korea, talk us through, like, once you both decided this was going to be your new beat, your new sort of career move, like, how did you prepare yourself?
I think the idea of being a correspondent has always been rooted in like a drawing of a perimeter around a geography, right? Be based somewhere, cover the region around the little perimeter. But the pandemic changed that for us and forced us to reinvent this role, because staying in South Korea and being locked down and not being able to travel was it didn't bode well for a trial run, and it almost made this job untenable, basically. Um, then I told Calvin, I was like, I don't think I'm doing very well. I need to keep moving. I need to be productive. I don't want to sit somewhere and not do anything.
yeah.
And we just started hitting the road and going to all the places without any coronavirus travel restrictions. Um, and it so happened that it took us to some of the roughest places, with the toughest assignments, and ever since then I started going from assignment to assignment, and hence why we just gave up on, at that point, the domicile thing idea, the idea of staying put in one place, I guess. And it changed that, and it's kind of set in place the idea that we needed to show that to prove the value of this role, we needed to show that we are productive and we can and work on things continuously and pitch ideas nonstop. So I think we tried to do that. And we made, you know, ever since I hit the road, I was, you know, I made three separate trips to Afghanistan, basically, you know, and built the foundations for, you know, the fall of 2021, basically.
And so, you know, typically you have the photographer, you have the reporter, you both go out. But now that you're sort of, you know, all in one, talk us through like your process. You identify, you know, the story or the region, you do the research. Talk us through the process of how the difference between just being, you know, strictly a photographer and now being a visual correspondent.
I guess in the past, photographers, we were siloed under the department in a way where we kind of took instructions. We worked on things in teams, we worked on things in big groups, and we got assignments. We were assigned to do things. You know, we, as a daily news photographer, especially in the newspaper business, we oftentimes we were told what to do and we were given assignments. So I feel like becoming a correspondent has really forced me to generate my own story ideas to pitch all the time. We have weekly story memos that go out to editors. So we kind of have to stay on top of it. And I think it's actually done me a lot of good journalistically. It's probably the best thing ever to just kind of be put in that, you know, be put in that kind of test. I mean, it's almost like baptism by fire, I think. And then going to Afghanistan really set in place that motion, because I remember when I was alone in the first week or so in Afghanistan and had no writing partner and my writing partner at that point was Nabi Boulos, the incredible Middle East correspondent. But unfortunately, due to certain unseen circumstances, he was stuck outside for a little bit, and we had to make do. So I was the only one representing the company in the country at that point.
And Calvin, why don't you talk us through your process? You know, you have Marcus out there, the pandemic happens.
Right.
And then you've got to deal with the other end of the business.
Are we talking about Afghanistan or are we talking about in general? Oh.
I would say first in general, and then we can
Okay.
focus on Afghanistan.
Yeah, again, you know, when Marcus was, you know, when he was based in LA, he was our point guy for COVID. He was our first photographer who got into a hospital in San Diego, and he got the doctors and nurses working on patients. It's something we've been trying to do for a month or so, and Marcus broke through. He also did a great job down in Tijuana with that mass grave of COVID victims. So again, Marcus has shown signs that he could come up with his own stories, and he pitched the idea of going down to Venezuela to get the migrants there, and we did a big spread in print and online. So I felt like, you know, Marcus, he was a Met Pro. He started 6 years ago. He was a trainee, and basically, like he said, he took assignments, and he grew from that. He grew as a journalist. So I felt like he was ready for something else, and he was ready to take on new challenges. So when he went overseas, he learned, he grew by leaps and bounds just because he had to navigate something he's never done before, and he did it by himself. So he is probably the most, I guess, out of all the photographers that I know, he is the most, I would say, most prepared. You know, he's always thinking 2 steps, 3 steps ahead, and it's amazing. Again, for someone who's just started as a trainee 6 years ago, so he grew by incredible leaps and bounds as a journalist.
And so now let's pivot and talk about Afghanistan. You decided, as you mentioned earlier, the pandemic had happened. You were itching to get out from South Korea. You reached out, I imagine you reached out to Calvin and said, I'd like to go. You both knew a lot of news organizations had already pulled out. So why don't you talk us through that process and how did you both come to the decision to go ahead and go? And then one step at a time, how did you come to that decision?
I think it was, you want me to start?
Go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah. Go
Okay.
ahead.
I think it was before the country fell. I remember like August 12th or 13. We were starting to see like, the news of like districts falling out, districts after districts falling to the Taliban. And I had kind of sounded the emergency alarm and jumped on a meeting with Calvin and other managing editors and others in leadership and to tell them like, I think this is happening. We got to go now. And made the case for it and basically said like, at the very least I'm there earlier. If it doesn't happen, at least somebody's there. It's better to be wrong in this. It's better just to be there in person. And because of the previous trips, I was very, very fortunate to have secured a long-term visa to Afghanistan the year before, thinking I might need it for the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And I think it was work that, a lot of like legwork that was put in like a year before that really paid off. And I flew right in and landed on August 14th, the day before the fall. And I remember running out telling Calvin, I'm going to run out the door. I'm going to, go from the airport to the refugee camps and start reporting. And we put out our first A1 story that day.
Yeah. So Marcus was the one who actually said like this place is going to fall quickly, and the rest of us was like, yeah, maybe a week, two, maybe a month, and all. Marcus, so he really he felt like it was very urgent, and it turns out his instincts was totally right. But so while he's there, soon after, it became very dangerous, and CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, AP started pulling journalists out, and there was pressure on me to pull Marcus out because he was by himself, had no support, and a lot of the editors were saying like, what are you doing? Get him out ASAP. And I have to admit, I was really scared because frankly, the last thing you need is to say, no, he's all right, and something happened to him. It's the worst thing that could happen to my career, to be honest, or to Marcus too, by the way. But so what happened?
I find, by the way.
So, but I was more about myself than so. So I would talk to Marcus. I say, hey, Marcus, and then, when we were discussing that or thinking about it, he also got beat up. He was at a rally and he got hit, and that was where the voices got louder. What? Get him out. Make the call. So I called Marcus and I said, like, look, there's a lot of pressure to get you out, and we may just have to do it. And Marcus, what did you tell me?
I just said I'm staying. I would like to stay, and I would like to continue this work. I think there's a lot at stake, and it's a very important moment, and we should, do not follow suit with everybody else, and it's worth staying. I think it was one person. It was easy. I was a small operation. We were a small operation compared to the rest of the outlets, and it's easier to get me out of the country, as and I had basically secured exit plans, I would say, to try to get out, and presented these exit plans to Calvin, and to make sure to reassure him, like, well, if they tell you to pull me out, present these options to them, basically.
Yeah. So yeah, he presented 3 option plans, and I said, okay, I'm going to support you. Let's do it. So Marcus stayed.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Marcus, go ahead.
And I'm very thankful for that moment. And I think it kind of set the tone very quickly about the kind, and it reinforced the kind of ambitious, ambitious journalism that we wanted to do. And Calvin and I have talked about this for a while. And sometimes in the face, some stories, they say no picture is worth dying for, and that is 100% true. But I've always believed some stories, and especially one where it involves like U.S. involvement, and the consequences behind it are worth teetering to the edge for.
And so how well, the being on the ground clearly was dangerous, the pressure from your publication. How were you able to still find the stories, such as the story we'll talk about in a few moments, but how were you able to actually find the stories that you did report on?
I felt it was one of those things where once you were on the ground, the stories just come up at you. I think it was a matter of going out every day for us. For me, in initial for the first like 8 or 9 days before my colleague Nabi Bulus joined me, it was the matter of like, I'm not going to sit inside, a compound or a shelter and wait this out. I'm going to go out. So every day I went out. Every day I went and poked my head around to see what was going on. Every day I went to like all the busy places, talked to people, and that's how I found my stories. I went to a market that went quiet, and just talked to like a business owner who sold burqas and bags, and basically told me like burqa sales are up basically, and also like told me like, and revealed that what kind of sales or what kind of styles of dresses are popular since the Taliban took over. And you don't glean that unless you go out and talk to people. You don't learn all this stuff, and also just talking to everyday people. One of the important things that really helped me with my coverage, and this is very, I thought very crucial, was Calvin and I think this is important. It reveals like how important a relationship between the editor and the person on the ground is, and Calvin and I had years to build this relationship. And 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 we studied in the beginning, the first couple of days of the fall, we studied the media coverage of what was going on all across the board. We looked at CNN, we looked at the Wash Post, the New York Times, everybody, BBC, everybody influential. And Calvin asked me, "What do you see? What patterns do you see?" And I think we identified that a lot of media outlets were looking at this historic moment through the eyes of the victor. Basically, everybody wanted to know what the Taliban was about, and only was fiercely talking about that. And I think Calvin, being like, a great sports enthusiast, and he's a sports photo editor on the side too, and he always tells me like the best stories are the ones when you turn your lens away from the guys holding a trophy, and look at the guys walking away from the field. And so we decided that we were going to look at this historic moment through the eyes of the everyday Afghans.
And so that brings us to the women's story. And if Chad would be so kind as to load up the link, can you tell us a little bit about this women's story?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things I told you, like I said before, the this idea of going out every day, like this all boils down to like what Calvin's always taught me, which is the best journalism is gumshoe reporting, which is just going out talking to people. You won't learn anything from Google searches. You won't learn anything from reading the news. Sometimes you do, but like the best thing to do is just go out and talk to people, and you learn a lot. You get a lot of your stories that way. And in one instance, I followed up with a contact, because and had lunch with her, and she basically told me of her situation. She's actually one of the stories, one of the women in these stories. She was a big time manager for a large corporation, and she had to move her office into the closet upstairs. and put a male coworker in her large, spacious, like executive office to pretend like a man is running the show. And and she had pitched to me like, this is like, these we are the biggest, the women will be the biggest losers from this. And and it's now looking that way in the current state of affairs. And the idea was not to talk about how bad the Taliban is, but is to talk about what they've learned in the past, and what they're observing. So the mission was to find women who have had their lives, changed and upended all of a sudden. And the mission was to have them like speak to us honestly and frankly about, their thoughts and reflection, and what they feared the most, basically. So from this one contact, I was able to find a few more. And then like, I kept, it was a mission. It was basically gumshoe reporting again. Like, you just work the phones nonstop. For every person you call, ask them for 5 more names, and you go from there, basically, and it spreads out. And I must have spoken to, like, I think I told, and Calvin was with me the entire time, and I told him it must have been like 25 to 30 women I spoke to, but only a few, a handful of them really agreed to, like, to want to speak, basically, for the story.
How did you earn their trust, especially given the situation there?
Earning trust is something, I don't know if there's a science to it. I think you just have to be, like, it's like everything in journalism. I think you just have to be honest about what you're doing. And I basically told them what I wanted to do. And this ultimately is a portrait project, and what I do need to photograph them. There is no way I was going to do an interview at that point and not do a portrait of them. So, and I think trust is a soft skill you kind of have to learn as a journalist. It's a very important soft skill. You have you have to convince people that you're just there getting their story out, and you don't have anything else, and really have nothing to lose. But I don't know. I think I'm asked that all the time, and I feel like I've been told that it's approach. I think you just have to be gentle, and you have to be thoughtful.
And when you were thinking about not only this, you wanted to turn this into a portrait series, were you also thinking about how will this story be presented? Is that part of also the process that you embark on when you're working as a foreign correspondent? And do you then, loop in Calvin, and you both sort of discuss or lay out, like, what is the visual presentation? What will it look like in print? What will it look like on social media? Do those sorts of questions come up as you're working on the story?
Actually, no. At the time, I was more like, let's just see what you can get, because I wasn't sure if he could get enough people to talk to. I was really astounded that Marcus was able to get. I mean, Marcus would meet with these people in like undisclosed area, and a lot of them were really like paranoid. Or if they saw someone that looked like from the Taliban, they would kind of like interviews over the whole thing. So I actually didn't even think about how it would run in print and all, because I wasn't sure he was going to pull this off. So, but once he did, then that's when we started talking about, like, that's what we talked about with like the editors at the paper about how can we run this and doing a special bill online. But yeah, that was much further down the road.
But to give a glimpse of behind the scenes was, every time I spoke I managed to get somebody on record, and every time I was able to photograph them, I shared it with him, like a snippet of that, the gist of that interview, basically, and their story, and then a small select group of photos, basically, that these are the best of these from this interview. So he, step by step, got to be part of the journey
Yeah.
and see the reporting and the portrait photography along the way. And he could see like, all right, we have something here, we have something here. And then from there, we can also like kind of craft our approach for the next person that we try to get on record. Like, all right, we spoke to this person with this kind of, that falls into this like category. We now need to find a person that offers us a different perspective, you know. And I worked not just with Calvin, but I worked with our foreign editor at the time, Jeff Fleischman, who was instrumental to shaping this story too.
Excellent. Well, we are at 6:30. I also want to make sure that we allow for questions, but as people put their questions into the chat, I don't want to not ask the question about how you both feel, you know, what the future of visual journalism looks like. Is it you know, more Marcuses? Will we see more Marcuses? Or are you encouraging, you know, more visual journalists to, you know, to do more reporting?
Well, certainly I've said this numerous times to the staff and to others, not well received necessarily, but I've always said that Marcus is the perfect example of what the future of photographers, staff photographers should be. It's no longer enough to just be a photographer. You've got to be able to write, do video, do social, report, and all. And so for us at the LA Times, you know, it's just increasingly important, especially since, you know, unfortunately, you know, print's dying, circulation online is not going as well. So we have to, our photography or our department is very expensive. And in order to prove our work, we've got to be first-rate journalists, as good as any journalist in the building. And so we got to come up with unique stories. We've got to be doing things, creating our own brand. So I think Marcus has done all of that. And really, I think that's the future of staff photographers here at the LA Times and probably in other places too.
Mm-hmm. Marcus, do you have any thoughts about that?
I would like to see other outlets have, you know, move forward with roles like these. I mean, where I think the future of our industry is not just doing assignments and just, you know, kind of illustrating ideas or words or text stories. I think I would like, and I think some of that is already done in like some outlets, yours included, where like I've seen like examples of incredible picture editors like coming up with their own stories, researching it, producing it, and then pitching it and collaborating with photographers. So like all that like pitching and brainstorming used to come from us in order to like, you know, kind of not take charge, but be more assertive in how we do things. And there are people already in our business who, and I, you know, there's so many names to name, but like there are people in our business who already do this. And I would like just love to see more photographers do it. And I think they do already, but you know, they might not be, you know, playing on a larger stage right now, and they may not have had the opportunity. So like then that itself is like a different talk to have, like, you know, how to get these opportunities to some of the, you know, visual journalists who have these skill sets, you know. But I think the future of our craft is, you know, I started my I started my career like, you know, dozen years or so ago or more, and I kind of made like some success. I had some success in dabbling in photos and videos and back then what we called multimedia, and I realize now, you know, photos and videos are a hard combination to practice to do, because it
Mm-hmm.
requires different ways of like approaching this job. I think when I found when I started to dabble in writing, I found that writing and photography are like, it's almost like the perfect marriage for me. At least it works for me because you know, I now, you know, I'm pursuing the story. I'm very much in tune. I know what's going on. And I just think that it's the same brain. You are focusing on details. I think the best writing, I'm kind of like playing catch up here because I'm not trained as a writer, but the best writing I've gravitated to is always ones with like cinematic details.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but it's interesting, when Marcus was in Afghanistan, we didn't want him to duplicate what the wires did. Like the wires cover the daily chaos at the airport and the American troops there. And I told Marcus to find your own stories, and he did well. But we continued that when he went to Ukraine the following year, and we told him just to do a visual blog where he would talk about not just reporting and what he shot, but also his personal experience. And I think because he was a brand, I think people resonate with that. And that visual blog had the largest page views out of all the stories out of Ukraine. So which we found, it was amazing. And we had 55 people who subscribed to it because of that visual blog, which is actually pretty astounding for a photo department. So I think we're on to something where we want photographers to go out there, whether they're covering, wherever they're covering, and kind of talk about not just what's going out there, but just their personal experience and what they feel and that kind of stuff. And again, Marcus did that with the Queen's death in England. But I think that's something for Marcus to pursue going forward.
Chad, I think we have a few questions. Do you want to throw some out, please?
Absolutely. We have 3 questions teed up, and the first one's from Hendrik. How do you take care of yourself once you come back from the field? For example, mental health, preventing yourself from either becoming numb to what you witnessed or from falling into the rush of just wanting to go out again and again for its own sake. And how does the LA Times support you when it comes to that?
That was a good question. Well, it's a work in progress. We're still figuring that part out, the support part. But I've never been one to have known what therapy is, and I've never been to therapy most of my life until recently. In this last year, I checked myself in because I started to realize the burnout can be real, and I do oftentimes, like after coming back from Afghanistan, I realized like I just wanted to go back in, and even though I was exhausted, even though I was like worn out, and I thought going back in would re-energize me, and I realized that way of thinking is wrong. And I think that's when I checked into therapy and started to get help and figure out like how to mentally sort things. I got advice from actually Clarissa Ward at CNN, who was very forthcoming about how she deals with this stuff. And the idea is that for our jobs, we kind of have to compartmentalize the things, the horrors, the weight of the thing, of the things that people share with us. But the trick is to compartmentalize, put it in a box, but never ever and sweep that box under the under anything and put it away. To leave that box on the shelf somewhere and to collect and set aside time to really address those boxes of things that you compartmentalize. So I think that's something I'm learning how to do, and I think the the LA Times is now figuring out how to best support me in that sense.
I appreciate the honesty to that question. And I would also like to ask Calvin, because I think oftentimes as picture editors and as, leading photography departments, and hearing you even talk about, the level of stress that you felt knowing that Marcus was out there, I would also ask you that same question.
Yeah, for me, we've talked long. When he was in Ukraine, we talked about like because he was photographing all these gruesome things, the heart in the middle of the road that was blown from a Russian soldier, beheaded dead bodies on the railroad track, all that stuff. And I would say to Marcus, "Are you okay?" And he was very like, "Yeah, what's the problem?" And I'm like, "No, I mean, this is going to catch up to you." And Marcus was he was pretty stoic, right? You were like, "Hey, I got a job to do, work." But we talked a lot about like, we'll pay for your therapist, remember that kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
and Marcus at the time would say, I don't need one, that kind of stuff. But I think but as the war grind on, and he had an experience that was probably the most terrifying experience for him and me. Do you want, Marcus, about the
Yeah, I at the second phase of the war, I stepped on a tripwire, and that set off a booby trap, and I mean it's I had wasn't in friendly territory, but it was a booby trap set by the Ukrainians for the Russians, that in case the Russians would ambush them from the river behind them, and they had forgotten all about it, and I had accidentally wandered into it, and fortunately for me, it was a a a
flash?
flashbang and not an IED. And I remember that moment played out in my head for several weeks. Like, that split second became
Yeah,
like more than minutes basically.
yeah,
And and I was actually with a fellow photographer who was roaming around with me for safety. And I remember that moment we looked at each other, and I felt the immense guilt of having placed that photographer next to me,
Mm.
and what what how that might have affected him too.
yeah,
So I think it was a very lucky, we were lucky to like have
right.
to be okay,
Yeah,
but it was a very scary moment. I remember calling Calvin immediately and like, I just want you to
yeah,
know, before you find out anywhere, like, before you find out from anybody else, you got to
yeah,
hear from me.
yeah,
But then we continued on our coverage and kept working after that. And I think that day I immediately called my therapist and like
yeah,
kind of worked out
yeah,
the steps and how to pack this away and
yeah.
continue, how to be operational
Right.
basically.
Yeah, and we got really serious about like, okay, Marcus, you got to like take care of yourself. You need to come out. There's no point. There's that by that time the Ukraine war wasn't on the front page. It was more like the day in and day out. I like it's not worth dying for, Marcus, come out, take care of yourself, get some help and all. And he did, unlike Afghanistan, he actually says you're right, and he came out, and that's so that was good. um, Marcus is one of those young guns, right, who thinks who I've always thought like he always felt like he was invulnerable, and the story was uh, was worth it and all. And I said, like, Marcus, you got a long career ahead of you. Don't just go into the fire every time, you know.
Thank you. Chad, anything else in the chat?
Yeah, we have a few questions lined up here. This one's from Bill, who asks, how did you get out of Kabul? What was the scene? And are you in touch with any of the Afghan journalists who fled?
Good question.
I've left Afghanistan 2 months later. I was there and I left via a humanitarian flight organized by the Qatari government, and had to figure out a spot under their flight, and was able to get out that way. I thought of staying much longer, but after finishing the reporting for that women's portrait story, I forgot to mention I also collaborated with a coworker, an amazing coworker, amazing writer, Laura King, who was also helping me guide and give me perspective of like what kinds of questions to ask. I'm not a woman. I'm not going to pretend to know what they're going through, and it's oftentimes when you're in this situation, it's good to get perspective, and it's important to reach out to people for help. And she was very very gracious to like walk me through some of the more sensitive things. She was the former bureau chief in Afghanistan years ago, and is familiar with the landscape there. And I have after I left, we needed to publish that. I don't think I could have done that while staying there, so I left. And I still keep in touch with the journalists who I met there, and I'm very good friends with some of them. Last year, for the anniversary, around the anniversary of the fall, instead of rushing back to Afghanistan, I chose to spend it with my driver who fled Afghanistan, to commemorate this moment with him, and then also chose to visit some of my journalist friends from Afghanistan, just to catch up and see what they need, how life is treating them. Some of them are in Maryland, some of them are in Virginia, some of them in New York. They're just spread out everywhere.
Chad, do you want to ask the next question?
Yes, yes. Julian asks, what advice would you have for someone who's interested in photographing and reporting internationally?
I think that's a question I get asked a lot, and I oftentimes tell people, like, if before you do that, you've got to recognize what skill sets you need to have. I think, and it boils down to basic journalism. We need to oftentimes, before we run overseas, and I think Sandra, you can attest to this. In the beginning of my career, a lot of my friends were, the Arab Spring was happening, and a lot of my friends were buying one-way tickets to Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, like, and were launching their, you know, launching their careers, I guess. And I just simply didn't have the money, and also didn't feel like that was my story to tell, and I wanted to focus on my skills. I just didn't have the skill sets at that point. And I think it's important to know, like, that, to recognize that and to build your skill set. So I think building chops is very, very important. Building, like, getting experience is very, very important. And you don't need like overseas experience to do overseas work. You need to have good journalism. So I think it's important to, like, find time to build that experience, would be it your local newspaper, be it your, an online publication somewhere, anywhere these days. I mean, I don't know what the landscape looks like now for a young journalist, but I think you just need to spend time, like, doing gumshoe reporting and grinding, doing, kind of being in the mix of producing every day, you know. And I'm glad I did that early on in my career, working in smaller publications, and and working in smaller newsrooms before coming to the Los Angeles Times. So I've had a lot of that perspective, and having worked from a newspaper that is like circulated at 10,000 all the way to the Los Angeles Times.
I'm so glad you pointed out the fact that it's important to be able to even cover the stories in your own backyard. I oftentimes think, young student journalists seem to think the only way they can make a name is overseas, but the US is so rich and full of diversity and diverse voices and diverse stories. And there are so many, picture editors such as you, Calvin, who are here and willing to mentor and to give people a chance, I would imagine too. So thank you for saying that. Calvin, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think Marcus said it well, actually.
Chad, do you want to ask the next question?
Yes. David asks, what language did you speak? And how did you plan ahead to get out of Afghanistan? And how did you find a fixer to help you around?
I don't speak the local languages in Afghanistan, so I, in the first days of the fall, was relying on the goodwill of Samaritans I run into on the streets. And this is like me going on the streets every day. And like, I remember the fall, and during the fall, the first day of the fall on the 15th, my driver abandoned me, and I resorted to taking a taxi cab to navigate the city. And the taxi cab driver obviously spoke very little or no English. And I would jump out of the car and try to speak to random people on the street, and some of them would speak English, actually. You'd be surprised sometimes, because a lot of them have come across Americans or have worked with Americans, so they, and was able to, like, rope them. It's like, can you help me talk to this person? And then we talked that way in the first couple of days, and then, like, and it was chaos, because all the fixers and all the translators were trying to get to safety, were trying to flee in the beginning days. So my first priority was finding a driver. Once I found a new driver, then I could work on finding a translator, and that was, like, very difficult in the beginning stages, and was really relying on other people a lot to help out.
Next
All right.
question.
Yes, we have another question from Olivier, who asks, in the past 2 years alone, you've covered Afghanistan, Ukraine, COVID, all tense, at times violent situations. Are there stories that bring you joy, stories you seek to disconnect from the violence you've seen?
Let me at least throw in a kind of this is something Marcus and I have talked about over the years. The fact is that when Marcus first came here, and I asked him, what do you want to do? What kind of photographer do you want to be? And he said he wanted to be a conceptual photographer, which is like, okay, remember that? And I like, okay, yeah, I would like to do something like, like putting things together and all, kind of like studio photographer. And so he started getting assignments. He started covering protests, the San Bernardino mass murder and all this, and he found his niche. He really loved covering that kind of stuff. So I've always joked that his joy is covering death and destruction, and so.
Oh God.
But that was a running joke we had. But Marcus found his niche that he really wanted to be. Why he wanted to be a photographer, he found it. He found it that he really wanted to cover that kind of type stories, right? That stories, and I think that drove him into why he became such a great photographer. I mean, he went through a lot of discomfort, things that other staffers would not do, because he found his thing. And it's something I always tell younger photographers: why do you want to be a photographer? Because there's long hours, you're carrying a lot of gear. And all, and a lot of photographers can't really answer that, But go ahead, Marcus. Sorry.
I mean, I want to answer Olivia's question, which is, that's a very good question. Thank you. I think the stories, I mean, I feel like joy is a tough word to latch on to for me. I think what gives me joy is the meaning I get from covering the work that I do. I mean, Calvin, his jokes aside, is that, I mean, I've always found meaning in covering struggle, meaning in covering, trauma and grief. And I think a lot of it has to do from within. I think it's like recognizing what my background was and how I deal with pain, how I've dealt with, like, with certain issues, like personal issues in my life. And I've always gravitated towards this stuff. And I feel like finding meaning or finding joy, for me is kind of helping shine a light on other people's, in not suffering, but struggle in a way, and giving dignity to their struggle. But in terms of stories that I try to disconnect, I think the stories that I feel like give me the most disconnect from all the conflict reporting that we do are the stories about, like, about good Samaritans, like goodwill and heroism, I guess. When I meet people who are doing things and are selfless, like in Ukraine, like we follow these volunteers who were hot wiring like abandoned cars and just driving whatever cars they could find to drive people out of a besieged city. Those were stories that lifted me and gave me a temporary relief from the war, even though the war was very much raging around us and we were very much in the car with him while artillery was coming down left and right. But I felt like this is why we do this, because this is why this is what gives me joy, is like shining, kind of working on those stories, because it kind of shows how good humanity can be.
Wow, that's pretty powerful. Chad, do we have more questions?
We have one more teed up right now from Amy, who asks a series of nuts and bolts detail questions here. Will you please share what a day might look like on these assignments? How do you communicate, workflow, charge camera batteries, upload from conflict zones? Where do you sleep and how do you communicate to stay safe? Can you please go through the process of shooting, staying somewhat anonymous, etc.?
Very good question.
Well, I'm going to keep this very vague, I guess, because but I think first Sandra and everybody else knows, who are editors here, know that, like, our first rule is we check in. We have a security check-in with our editors, right? We have a predetermined time we check in, like, and we check out, and we check in. It's like, hello, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. I'm safe. This is what I'm going to do today. And these are all plans you have made the day before. You can't go out without a plan, basically. You got to know where you're going, point A, point B, and follow that plan. And if you find something else, then add it to tomorrow. Sometimes there's room for improvisation, but oftentimes it's not wise to improvise without letting your editor know, basically. So we try to stick to that rule for safety reasons alone. I mean, gear wise, I keep my gear simple. I oftentimes carry one camera, one lens. I flew into Afghanistan with one camera, one lens because at that point we were in between. Was strapped for gear, and I didn't have enough gear on me. So I've since kept my work style very simply, hiding my camera in a messenger bag that I carry around the world with me. Basically, I call it my Jack Bauer bag, and in there is my all the things I need for the day, and that's it. And then when I'm not taking pictures, I put my camera bag in the bag and move on, and I look like a schoolboy going to school basically half the time.
Well, I think we are almost at time unless anyone else has a question that they want to drop in the chat. But if not, Calvin, do you have any parting words or advice or thoughts that you could leave us with?
Well, again, I will reiterate that Marcus is a great example of what future photojournalists should strive for. Someone who can do it all and not just take photos. So I think Marcus is great in planning, talking about what he wants to do, and how to execute it. So whether it's video, social media, photography, writing, I think you got to do it all. You got to be the complete journalist, and Mark is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, I think I've learned in the last year or two of this job. I haven't done this job for very long. I've learned that there is that all these little things, even reporting or even doing audio recordings or little snippets for social, you are still reporting, and it all helps the photography because you glean a lot more context, doing all these little things, and it enriches the photography in a way. If you allow it to, it can enrich the photography in a way that is beautiful.
Well, Calvin and Marcus, thank you so much for your honesty, especially when it comes to sensitive subjects such as mental health. I think it's important that we all take care of ourselves as journalists. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate everyone in the audience. Even though I can't see you, we can't see you, we appreciate the questions, and thank you very much. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks.